of our Holy Conversation. We've had two fantastic sessions, I believe, beginning with looking at the biblical foundations for how we view sexuality and what the Bible does and does not say about human sexuality, and in particular LGBTQ issues. And last week we had a wonderful session where we had some experts in the field, particularly of transgender people, and what that transition was all about and how that happens medically and scientifically. Fascinating information, new information to many of us, I believe, based on the feedback I got. This evening we're going to talk about where we stand as the United Methodist Church at this point in terms of LGBTQ issues. I'm going to try to give us not only information, but since this is Holy Conversations, I'm also going to give you quite a bit of time this evening to engage with others at your table, and I'll give you more directions about that as we move through the evening. Did everybody get a booklet on their way in? Looks like this. Okay, because we're going to be using this. This is going to be your reference guide. Judy has some in the back there. Belinda, if you didn't get one, raise your hand. We can bring you one or retrieve one for you. There's a number of articles in here. The first couple of pages are from questions. Last week we ran out of time, but we had given people an opportunity to ask questions to the speakers. A couple of those questions were legal questions, so I sent those to Alyssa Bryant, who was the attorney that was here speaking, and so she wrote out some answers, and then a few minutes later she said, I think I can do better than that. Let me do this again. And she edited her own work and then sent me these two answers that we have here. I asked her permission to print those for you tonight. So I don't know who asked the questions, but they were interesting questions in terms of some legal perspectives on this, and also particularly the second one relating with is religious belief grounds for discrimination? So the courts have ruled in one big case, at least with Hobby Lobby, saying yes, you can read Alyssa's answer. She questions whether or not that will hold up in courts over time. Then the next page says October 15th, handout 1 from Reverend Wiggs. It's an excerpt from our United Methodist Book of Discipline, Call to Inclusiveness. Those are all direct quotes right out of our Book of Discipline, talking about United Methodist as an inclusive people and what that means, and much of what it means is exactly what we're doing here in terms of talking together about how we might embody Christ, both in terms of who we are and how we do church together and leadership. And then over another page that says October 15 again, handout 2, statements on human sexuality. And then basically I've given you excerpts again covering a whole variety of topics related to sexuality that are quotes. If you don't recognize the funny little symbol, that's how United Methodists say paragraphs. Our Book of Discipline is numbered by pages, but they really use paragraph numbers to find things, and so that little kind of backward P that looks like somebody colored in, there's probably a name for that, but I don't know what it is. Anyway, that's a paragraph sign. So those are paragraph numbers if you ever wanted to go look at a discipline and read the whole paragraph or whole page about that. Then there's a summary of the timeline in terms of the historical part of this discussion as related to general conferences. That's the group of delegates that represent all of Methodism. That's the only official group that can speak on behalf of the United Methodist Church. That group meets every 4 years, so you will notice in the description there it goes 72, 1976, 80, 84. That's why the years, unless you know that the group meets every 4 years, probably doesn't make sense. But it's giving you indication of what's happened right up through the General Conference, which the last one happened in 2016 in the spring in Portland, Oregon. The next one's scheduled for 2020. Except that they've set a special one to deal with this issue that's going to happen in February of 2019. So we'll talk more about that later in the evening, but that's just a primer. That's for you to take with you. You may also want to use it later when I'm going to ask you to make some decisions together as a table, and you might want to reference some things out of that. So before we go any further, I've asked Reverend Amy Venable, one of our associate pastors here, to come and offer our prayer as we begin.
I'd like to offer a prayer that was written by Miriam Therese Winter, and I'm getting this out of a book called Shaping Sanctuary, which our very own Carl Koch picked up at a convention over 10 years ago and handed it to me as a gift, and it's barely holding together. I've used it so many times. Let us pray. Holy God, we confess that the circle of love is repeatedly broken because of our sin of exclusion. We create separate circles, the inner circle and the outer circle. We confess that the circle of love is broken whenever we cannot see eye to eye, whenever we cannot link hand to hand, whenever we cannot live heart to heart and affirm our differences. We confess that the circle of love is broken whenever there is alienation, whenever there is misunderstanding, whenever there is insensitivity or a hardening of the heart. Through God's grace, we are forgiven by the mercy of our Creator, through the love of the Christ, and in the power of the Spirit. Let us rejoice and be glad. Glory to God. Amen.
You may have a card, or you may have seen on the screen as you entered, just a couple of things I want to remind us of in terms of ground rules for a holy conversation. If you have a card on the purple side, it says the foundations are: number one, all people are children of God, and number two, love of God and love of neighbor are at the center of all we do. Then on the back, I suggest there's some consequences that lead us in behavior that will honor the sacred words of all persons, that we will seek to do no harm, that will respectfully listen to learn, will be willing to explore the sources of our differences with goodwill, and at all times we will be kind, as together we humbly seek the mind of Christ to do the will of God in all we say and do. So that's kind of just a reminder of when we begin to have our discussion as a total group or at your table, that we want to live by those ground rules together as we move into this discussion tonight. So the first thing I'll let you do is discuss for just about 4 minutes at your table any concerns that you're aware of that you bring with you. When you're thinking about coming to talk about human sexuality or homosexuality, or where the church is with sexuality, what did it feel like? What did you think about? What concerns did you have when you were coming? Just share that at your table. I'll be your timekeeper. I'm giving you 4 minutes. Okay, I hope everybody at your table had time to share and wanted to do so. Here's the next question, maybe a little bit more difficult. I want you to try to think of an issue. Think of an issue, not human sexuality, but an issue where you know there's a diversity of opinion, but during your lifetime you've experienced a change in your own opinion. Okay, so you've come to understand someone else's perspective, or you've gained more knowledge, or for some reason or another, you've changed your own opinion on an issue. Try to think of one of those and share that with your group. I'll give you 6 minutes to do that. All right. If I can have your attention again. Got a couple of our youth who are going to help us pass out a handout. Every table gets one handout, so you have to be able to share to do this exercise. What I put on the sheets are some different scenarios happening within the United Methodist Church. You're not going to have time, I don't believe, to discuss all 6 of them, I'm going to read through the 6 for you, and then you can choose one or more to discuss. I'm going to give you 15 minutes, so you want to keep that in mind in terms of how many you try to cover. The first one is about a United Methodist pastor who served with distinction for over 30 years and then marries his same-sex partner. What would you do if you had the authority to make the decision as to whether he is allowed to stay in pastoral ministry or if he is to be removed? The second scenario is the same person in scenario 1. He has shared his sexual orientation and relationship status with every district superintendent and bishop who has supervised him. They've all continued to appoint him with that knowledge. What should happen to them? That is, if the pastor is put on trial, should these supervisors also be put on trial? The third one says, a lesbian bishop is elected by the Western jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church in the USA. If you're not familiar with our jurisdictions, that's from Colorado to the West Coast, basically. She has served openly as a married lesbian prior to her election, is now serving without complaint. That is, no United Methodist person has filed charges against her, as provided for within the United Methodist Book of Discipline, except a complaint has been filed about her sexual orientation. What should happen? Number 4 is an ordained elder serving without complaint, transitions in gender. Should this disqualify the pastor from continuing to serve as a pastor? 5 says the United Methodist Church is active in African countries where homosexuality is a crime. What should the witness of the United Methodist Church be in that country? And then the final one says, at one time smoking, drinking alcohol, and dancing were prohibited for Methodist clergy. Divorced men, as well as all women, were prohibited from serving as clergy. All of these prohibitions have been omitted from our current Book of Discipline. If you had a vote, would you eliminate the prohibition against LGBTQ persons serving as ordained clergy if they met all other qualifications? So you can choose one of those to discuss or a couple of those. Like I said, I don't think you'll have time to cover all 6 because we have 15 minutes. If you can do that, we want you to go to General Conference and sort this thing out. So, I'll be your timekeeper. Oh, we've got 15 minutes on the screen, so you can count yourself down. Fantastic. Thank you, Douglas. All right. Fire away. Have a discussion. We're going to take a few minutes to hear back from the tables. This is a little bit tricky. Any pastor who's ever done a funeral and let someone else speak knows when you hand somebody else a microphone, anything can happen. So, just so you remember what we're doing, what I'm going to ask you to do is report for your table sort of what the main parts of the discussion were. I'm not really looking for your personal opinion, nor for a long soliloquy. Oh, I've got the mic now. Maybe I should tell them what I really think. You can tell me what you really think, but not when you have the microphone, okay? So, I'll be glad to tell you what I really think. You tell me what you really think. But what we're looking for now is for for somebody from each table to share just a little bit, like no more than 2 minutes worth. Because we've got, I haven't counted, 14 or 15 tables. So it'll take us 30 minutes, even if you just do 2 minutes. So, looks like Christopher has the mobile mic. So I can start back here at Jerry's table if there's somebody who wants to report. Was there somebody that was going to share? You want to pass? Okay, we'll come back to you. Somebody at Debbie's table? Deanna? All right, let's listen up.
Well, we talked about number 2. If the same person from the number 1, he has shared his sexual orientation and relationship status with every district superintendent and bishop who has supervised him, and they have all continued to appoint him with this knowledge, what should happen to them? We think that if they are knowledgeable of this, what was their thinking on appointing this person? Obviously, this person was bringing something valuable to the congregation. It was showing being of worth of having this appointing. So why does the sexual orientation or race or gender has to come to play after this person has shown his worth?
Okay.
So if this person is put in the hot seat, so to speak, the people that have appointed him or her should be accountable for the decisions.
Okay. So you're saying if the pastor's put on trial, so should the supervisors be?
Yes. Yeah, I cannot appoint somebody and let them take the responsibility by themselves or herself if we have made that decision.
All right, very good. Thank you for sharing. Does the table next door want to share? Mike's pushing his chair back. Very good.
We talked about the same one that they did,
Okay.
and very similar in agreement as far as that goes. What our contention is, and this is something I think that we need to address, and looking at the book that you gave us, David, we talked about the book of discipline. It's pretty black and white in the book of discipline. It says exactly this is what you have to do. And if that's the case, then everyone that's involved in this should be held accountable by either that or we need to address the book of discipline.
I
And
think
we need to address that and get it back into a position where we can do what she just said. But if the book of discipline is the rules and regulations that we operate under the Methodist Church, then it's pretty black and white.
I think you've described very accurately where we are as a denomination. And that's going on in a lot of different places. That's just one illustration, but it's happened in a whole variety of different states and conferences where this has been handled in a great variety of ways with little consistency, I would say. So, all right, we're in the corner.
Believe it or not, we did 2 also.
Oh, the back row,
But we also did 4.
okay.
But I will tell you that we are in agreement that personally, we don't think there should be anybody tried here. But
Okay.
intellectually, yes, and it's the book of discipline that needs to be brought to task.
Okay.
And with number 4, as far as the ordained elder serving without complaint, transitions in gender should disqualify the pastor from continuing to serve as a pastor. We're still a pastor. What's gender got to do with it?
Okay.
And we brought out something else too. Is there gender in heaven?
Is there gender in heaven is a great question. You've gone deep into the theological waters, Mark. Thanks for asking. All right, we're ready for the next table.
We wanted to tackle a pretty hard one on number 5.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I don't know why that's happening. But I think it would involve a whole lot more conversation than what we were able to give it for just 10 minutes. But the main goal, I think, of any and all churches would be to push any congregation members into a place of safety. And so if political law would be criminalizing such people, I think that people's safety is of utmost importance, but that if and when the church's stance changes, then the church, especially in those countries, if it's as large as I'm told that it is, that there has to be some sort of political influence in those regions to try to have those laws changed and to advocate for those congregation members. So to plead for political change, but also to keep congregation members safe. But it also means a lot more time and discussion.
There you go. I think we understand that. Thank you so much. Somebody at the next table want to report? They're going to pass for now? They'll pass? We can come back around?
Imagine this, me. Okay, so we went, stop laughing. We went straight to number 6 because we think it's the crux of everything. We were all in agreement. All God's children, all persons of worth. What difference does it make? We understand the complexities of the Book of Discipline, where the United Methodist Church is heading. This is very difficult, but it's time. That was our thought.
All right. And you say your whole table was in agreement?
We were united this table.
Right. 8 whole people, United Methodist. Way to go.
Well, it's kind of interesting. We did get to number 6 too, and so although we had quite a good discussion, starting with one and going through several of them, some of us feel like it's hard not to follow the rules, and if the rules are the law, it's kind of hard. One of our members is not yet a member, so I'm so glad she's here tonight. But anyway, she said, well, so wait a minute. So some of the different districts come up with a different solution to the same question. And our esteemed colleague said yes, Mike Asher said yes, and she said, well, then it's not a law, is it? I thought that was kind of interesting. So we did agree on number 4 that it couldn't find it in the Book of Discipline, so it can't be a problem. You know, if you're going to transition, then what does gender have to do with it? And then we all did vote in united agreement on number 6. And then that would solve many of these problems. So, thank you.
Right. I would just, for anybody, general knowledge, the Book of Discipline does not claim to be infallible, nor does it claim to be the eternal word on United Methodist polity or doctrine. There is a process for changing the discipline with that expectation that we do learn and grow over time, and do in different times perhaps call for changes in terms of how we order and structure and govern ourselves. So it really isn't law, but it does function as church law if there's a complaint or a charge or a trial. I have a question in the back.
When you
We might need a microphone, Stephanie.
no, when you become a minister, do they ask you your sexual orientation?
When I became a minister, nobody asked me that question. There's a lot of other pastors in the room. I doubt that anybody was asked that question, but if one of you all were, you could tell me now. There's a microphone right behind you.
In some annual conferences, that question is asked. I'm familiar with the Baltimore, Washington conference. I know someone who was on the board of ordained ministry there and who was a closeted gay, but he made sure that question was never asked of any candidates at that Baltimore, Washington annual conference.
Because some didn't want to ask, you're suggesting.
I don't, no, well,
He just steered it in another direction.
he was not alone in that.
Okay. Yes, over here. We'll get back to the tables, do not fear.
I attended the, what's it called? What is the thing that we've gone to, Carl? No.
Reconciling Ministries.
The Reconciling Convention, Convocation
Yeah.
Convention. I couldn't get that word. I don't know, 12 years ago, I guess, I went to the Reconciling Convention in Estes Park, Colorado. And Reverend Debbie Ingram pulled me aside and said, there's a conservative, great big email list that I'm on because I want to know what they're saying. And they're saying that you are a lesbian, Amy, and you're coming out of the closet at this convocation. And I was very tall at the time. I had short hair and I was divorced. So of course I was a lesbian. And I mow my own lawn, so that seals it. But nothing ever came of it. I figured it was one person or maybe 2 or 3 people who did not like me and did not like the fact that I was pastoring a reconciling congregation there in Norman and probably thought I ought to grow my hair out some and get a perm. But nothing ever came of that. I chose to ignore it, not to respond to it. I thought the more oxygen I give this thing, the worse it will get.
Okay.
So,
I would say that people are asked what their views on the topic are in one way or another when they're going through the ordination process. I don't believe Paul Stott's in the room tonight, but Paul was going through ordination while he was on staff here, and he reported to me that people did attack him because he put that he was in favor of the church becoming open and inclusive in a whole variety of ways, one of which was LGBTQ issues, and that there were people on his committee. There's interview committees. There's a large board that has to vote whether or not you get to proceed, and there's smaller committees within the larger board, and you interview with a smaller committee. So a lot of it does have to do with which committee gets your name, but he was saying on his committee, there were some people who were probably on the same list that were wondering about Amy, that were attacking him. He felt attacked rather than being in a conversation about life and faith together. He really felt attacked. And Paul ultimately dropped out of the process partially because of that. So that's sort of where that is. Susan?
Why would this not be illegal under American law?
What's that? That you ask someone's...
Why did the church be able to ever ask this question in America? You can't do that.
Why can we ask that? Because when you're going through ordination, you voluntarily submit to the Board of Ordained Ministry and the bishop to say and do whatever they want, basically. Right, right, right.
Under American law, they can't ask what? Your sexual orientation?
That's not true. They cannot, there is no federal protections for sexual orientation and gender identity.
So they could, so he's saying that you can't ask that in
You could ask that. And they can decide whether to hire you or fire you over it. There's only 8 states in the entire United States that have had state policies, but there are no federal protections.
Remember, we saw a map during the presentation last week. I think that's where we saw it, of those states and how few of them there are. So, all right, before we get on to Q&A, let's continue with our table reports. Do we have a report here? Belinda appears to be, yes.
Well, we're in this row, and yes, we took question number 6. We too all agreed on the yes. And the thing that was so telling to me was that we all had to be willing to stand up because we had too much to lose in human resource and talent when we separate ourselves from other people. But the story that brought that home was Catherine said she graduated from Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas when the 9 were there. And the 9 people who stood up, and being a kid in high school, she was there. And we can all relate to that. But now it's time, she reminded us, you have to take a stand and you have to support.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I took notes, but I said I was not going to talk.
Can somebody else read your writing?
Oh, maybe not. We did question number 2, and I guess if the pastor that's in question, I guess Jennifer said that self-avowed means it's defined as being revealed to the DS.
Right.
And the bishop, and that they should be accountable also. But someone else had a good point saying if those other people were all accounted or held accountable also, it would show the support for the pastor that's being held on trial. Then there would be a whole line of people who say, we support this person as a minister, and so.
I have a question.
Good question.
When they asked, who of the ministers were ever asked about their sexual orientation, perhaps no one said, if you said yes, maybe they didn't make it to be a minister.
That is true.
Okay, the same sort of thing, but I was going to ask you if you think as time goes on and this is becoming more of a volatile issue, do you think they're asked more? I mean, back when you were going through, not that you're old, but they were,
But I'm a little bit old.
nobody was talking about any of that in any setting. So do you think as the younger ones are coming up, that's becoming more of a question?
Yes, it's become much more prevalent. The whole discussion about identity and sexual orientation has become much more prevalent in all Methodist meetings that I attend, basically. People are concerned one way or the other. There's a mic.
There's much more tolerance in the younger generations.
In some places.
I mean,
Yeah, I thought that's what he was doing. I thought he was going to do a table report.
We started on number 3, and I know it will surprise no one in this room that we got off topic. but
I think we're the first one that took on number 3, so.
Well, we talked about letting local conferences decide that, but then we discussed the structure of the Methodist Church, and if you do that, then you have to wipe out the whole structure that we have, because we are a connectional church, and that doesn't allow local groups to make the decision. And then we started talking about the different Methodist churches in Tulsa and how the whole thing with property rights and who would get what, and it was going to be a big mess. So we kind of got off topic after that.
Right. Okay. Although we do give some local autonomy to pastors, the United Methodist pastors, all pastors, get to decide who they will marry in terms of heterosexual couples. You can come to a church or to a pastor and ask me to officiate at your wedding. I have the right to say yes or no based on my own feelings or thoughts and judgments about whether or not this is a valid relationship and whether the church ought to be involved in uniting these two people. If I have grave concerns about that, I can refuse to do that. So in some issues, we have decided that it's okay for pastors to have that kind of local authority or local autonomy to make a decision about something like marriage. But then, when the discussion heated up, there was a majority vote to say, but I don't have the same authority, or you might say wisdom, to be able to make that decision about a same-gender couple. So it's an interesting little nuance that we've set aside in this particular case. But there is some precedent for local churches and local pastors making determinations about what they're going to do within the broader structure. Okay, which table are we at? Right here in the middle.
Hello there.
So the youth table decided to take on number 5, which was the African countries, and with the government with their laws that saying that homosexuality is prohibited, we all came to an agreement that the government is not the church, and that the church should be able to, if the church should be able to create a safe haven for you if you are, in fact, a homosexual. And that if you go to church and you are, gay, then they should not prohibit you from going to their church just because you were gay. And there are many, in the United States that is still a problem. But,
good insight.
But, in Africa, of course, that's the government, that is the law. So, yeah, so it's just, yeah.
That's where we're at. Well, the penalty in some of those countries is death. So it's a little more severe than some other places. So, all right.
Our guys started with number 6 because we were aware of an actual situation where in Western Oklahoma a few years back, that divorce was a question. And and they withdrew an appointment just because of that case. But the bishop waited to appoint somebody after that, and they got an inadequate pastor after that. So anyway, we got off on talking about the info from last session.
Yes.
It was helpful to all of us.
Yes.
Also, that if a clergy showed up with a same-sex partner, that would be okay. But we have to maybe think about if the clergy senior pastor was transsexual. We'd have to think about that.
Okay.
And then the African thing, that's a cultural matter, and it is difficult. They seem to reflect the ethic of the 1800, the 19th century missionaries that went to Africa and just stayed there. And so, for somehow, the rest of us went on from there, and they just haven't caught up yet. We just kind of said, like some of the rest of you, we need to work on the discipline, is what we need to do.
Okay, work on the discipline in some of these issues. All right. I think we're going to the far corner.
Okay, you might think you're hearing an echo because we also talked about number 6. Basically, we had a lot of really good points made at our table, if I do say so myself. But the gist of what we said was that the church is made up of people, and so the church has got to change with the people, or it's not going to be a thing anymore. And it won't survive. So that was kind of the gist of it. And we specifically talked about divorce and kind of how the way that it's written about in the Bible and the way that it was in biblical times is so very different than divorce in the modern world. And so we've adapted to that. And just like that, we need to adapt accordingly in all other areas. And the other good point that was made was that if somebody works really hard to become a pastor and feels that that's their calling, clearly that's their priority, and their priority is not to be some big sinner or to do, anything other than positive things for the church. So why would we ever turn someone away from that?
Thank you. Other tables?
There's 2 more tables who didn't talk.
2 more tables. We got everybody. We had a couple that skipped. We're going to give you a second chance.
Okay. Are you guys just when you're talking?
Coming back to the corner. Jerry and Susie are both looking at each other, shaking their heads no.
We discussed, but we didn't really follow your directions to the left. We'll pass.
One of those tables. One of those tables. Independent thinkers. What are we going to do with you all? You're good Methodists. Toby's got his hand up behind you, Stephanie. Toby's going to help. He's going to help his table out.
I will address on number 5, I just mentioned in my table mails, there's only 2 countries on the African continent that have death penalties for homosexual relationships, but they also say you can't harbor them. If a family member finds out they have a homosexual family member, they have to turn them in, or they'll be prosecuted at the same level. The vast majority of the countries in the world that have death penalties associated with their policies, most of them are Middle Eastern countries, or Asian, kind of Asian, like Indonesia, places like that. Russia, India have punitive policies if you address homosexuality or transgender issues in school settings. You can't produce materials. There's several countries that have different prohibitions, but right now, unless somebody's aware of something different, we only have 28 countries in the world that have punishable by the death. And most of those are places like Saudi Arabia and places like that. Which we would be surprised because we would not consider those backward or third world countries.
Right. So there may be some mixing of religion and politics like there is everywhere else in terms of how that law gets determined in some of those countries. All right. Did every table who wanted to report get to report? Dr. Thompson? She's fast. Work with Jimmy Jones.
We hesitated when you first came around to comment because, but we're doing so we aren't discriminated against. Apparently, we misunderstood the title of this, Holy Conversations. This table felt that we came here to get facts. Specifically, where the Methodist Church stood, or what's the latest on this, and so forth. We really didn't get here. We really didn't come here for holy conversation. So our apologies, because we didn't feel that we have enough facts yet for holy conversation.
Okay.
We came here for Methodist facts. What is the Methodist Church? Where does the Methodist Church come historically? Where does the Methodist Church stand this minute? And how are trends? What are the trending? And how do we prepare, so to speak?
Okay.
What are the preparations for this up and coming vote?
Okay. So the language, the facts, or the language are in the booklet I gave you when you arrived. So if you haven't read that before, you can read that so you'll have the exact wording of what the United Methodist Church says. It has statements, as I read them, that are on both sides in a whole variety of positions in terms of how one might address this. And so it's not, I'm not suggesting that once you read through it, there's a clear stance, because I don't think there is a clear stance. There's a variety of stances taken within the Book of Discipline, because different paragraphs of the discipline are written by different committees. At General Conference, they function like the Congress does. If you don't know, the United Methodist Church basically parallels the United States government in terms of how we're organized and how we function. And typically what's happening in the culture is also happening in the United Methodist Church. We kind of grew up together. So the General Conference is our legislative branch, so they function like the Congress. So they meet in subcommittees and work on different paragraphs or different topics within the discipline, and then they take a series of votes, and then some of those go to the floor and there's more votes taken. Some of those are just sort of, the committee says we're all good here, and the floor, the plenary session just accepts that. And so as you know, just like if you're decorating the parlor by committee, if you have one group picking paint and one group picking carpet and one group picking furniture, it may not be a consistent color scheme when you're finished. That's how we have written the discipline. And so we have a commission on the way forward, it's called, that came out of the 2016 General Conference. 32 members representing best they can, multi-millions of members, and 32 people who are charged with reading everything I've put in your booklet and the greater paragraphs around those statements and trying to write a more consistent and coherent statement in terms of how we might go forward. That's why it's a commission on a way forward. They're trying to figure out, can we move ahead as a denomination? Is there a way to speak about this that we continue to move forward as a denomination, as a worldwide denomination? I think there will also be, as many of you noted in your discussion, that if there's going to be some changes, it probably also has to include some structural changes that give some authority at different levels of government besides worldwide making all the decisions. The commission is going to bring a statement. The discipline requires that it be public 290 days before the General Conference, and the General Conference is in February of 2019. So sometime this spring, that statement will be made available to everyone who's interested. So we'll have what their recommendation is. It doesn't mean that the delegates will accept what they propose. They can vote it up or down, they can take it apart, they can rework it. They are the legislators, if you would. They're the representatives of the rest of us. So they get authority to work on that. Usually they meet for 10 days. They're going to be in St. Louis, Missouri this time. It moves from city to city, 4 days long. So that's where we are, is we have a lot of different statements, and we're kind of, I think, up in the air about that. Certain individuals are very clear what they believe and what they think should happen. But if you read through the discipline, you see that there's a whole variety. Some statements very supportive of LGBTQ people, some statements very condemning. That's sort of the facts. The other facts are that we have all these scenarios. These are real cases. I didn't just make these up. This is really what's happening. And but I thought it was important that you all have a chance to process that together. Susan.
Do you have any idea?
Microphone.
What are the percentages? What are the percentages? I mean, where do we fall? How many are in? If there's two camps, which is probably not that easy, but
Right, not quite as easy as two camps.
No.
I will say Carl was at General Conference, Twyla. Some of them may have a better idea than me. Some of the votes are very close. Failing or passing when they vote. Some of them are, much greater majorities than others, and it kind of depends on what the exact paragraph is that they might be discussing. So it's not consistent.
What say for just strictly ordination?
Any help? Carl, any help? I don't really know what the vote on ordination was. We can find that.
There was no vote on ordination at the Portland Conference.
Because they took everything off the table.
What happened in the...
Give him a microphone, please.
In the committees, a number of petitions were moved forward for consideration of the General Conference that were very reactionary and would have really destroyed the present liberties we have within the church. This bothered the bishops. The Council on Bishops, after the General Conference had voted to order the General Board on Church and Society and the United Methodist Women to withdraw from the Planned Parenthood organization, that the General Conference, or that the General the Committee on Church and Society had helped formed. They were ordered to withdraw from that body. The bishops were concerned that if these petitions came to the floor and were voted on, it would have been really a disaster. So to prevent those petitions from being accepted, the Council on Bishops recommended that all action on these petitions be deferred until this new committee could take a look at
Could
these.
work on those as well.
Yeah.
So that's part of the discussion as well.
So that was the action, okay, let me break it down.
They're bringing you a mic.
Back when all this, I don't know what you'd say started, but when this became heated, it was my understanding that then the bishops said, we will meet the council, the bishop council. We will meet and come up with our recommendation.
No.
That didn't exist?
No, the bishops appointed a committee.
That's why we need facts.
The bishops appointed a committee, the membership of which was composed of people across the board. And that committee has been meeting since last winter, I guess.
The way forward.
And they, I'm not sure what the status of their deliberations are now, but it was that committee that was directed to come up, if there's a way forward, please show us what it's going to be.
Okay, now when will we hear their report?
That's the 2019, February.
February 19th?
That's when they'll vote on it. It'll come out 10 months before that. It will come out this spring at some point. It'll be published. Because it has to be a public document before it gets to general conference. It has to be distributed.
Yeah, and I think just so that we all know too, the general conference that's happening in February of 2019 is a special called general conference just to talk about human sexuality. So there will be no other conversation other than human sexuality. So our next general conference should have been in 2020. And so when 2016 happened, the Council of Bishops met and they decided their statement was to create the Commission on the Way Forward and to have a special called general conference. So that's what will happen in February of 2019. So they'll meet for those 4 days only on human sexuality.
And will that be the definitive statement that they make or vote on?
As far as I know.
That's done with in 2020, in other words.
Then 2020 continues.
Visited that on 2020.
Well, I don't think you can.
I don't think you can say that.
Conclude
Yeah.
that.
Because because the Book of Discipline is always up for debate.
Okay, that's what I said.
Yeah, so you can always
But
write.
that could change after 2020.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, there will be another general conference a year later.
Right.
After the special called one in 2019, there will be a 2020 general conference. My guess is they'll resolve it one way or another, so it's not the central, most hotly debated topic. Okay, we're about out of time. On your tables, there's a little half sheet of paper. It asks for some feedback. You can put your name on it if you like, but you're not required. One thing I learned today, I have a question about, or I would like to know, we're asking you to fill those out. There'll be people standing at the back doors as we exit this evening, holding baskets, I think, that you can drop those in. While you're distributing those and such, I'm going to call on Becky Collins. She's one of the chair people of our work area on church and society. They lead us in much of this work on this topic and others around some of these issues, so I'm asking her to share a word with us.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Becky Collins, and I'm very fortunate to have a fabulous co-chair, Carl Koch. Raise your arm, please. We are both co-chairs of the Church and Society Committee. And I am a Reformed Episcopalian, so I had a lot to learn when I joined the Methodist Church. And even though I've been a member now for 30 plus years, I didn't know there was a church and society committee at the national level until we got one started again here. And our committee works on many of the different social principles that are in the Book of Discipline. So all of you can just Google Book of Discipline and you can pick your favorite social principle, and it has a lot of subcategories. But our committee is working through different ones. And I would love to have any of you join us. We do work on the issues that we've talked about tonight, but David pointed out that we will have a great speaker for our next Barton, Clinton, Gordy lecture series, and it's on race relations. So our committee hopes to pick up that ball and keep it rolling next spring. But in the meantime, Amy also mentioned, Amy Venable, that there's a reconciling group within the Methodist Church. And Boston Avenue United Methodist Church is not a reconciling church, but there were some members in the church that wanted to have a reconciling group. So Jackie Neal started that here about 3 years ago, and we worked through all the procedures that are required to be called a reconciling group. And so the Church and Society Committee has a subcommittee called Crystal River. And Crystal River, and Carl wore the shirt about Crystal River last Sunday, and so we would invite you, if that's your particular issue that you're interested in talking about, we invite you to join the Crystal River group too. And we meet once a month, mostly, and we do fun things, like somebody here is wearing the t-shirt from the Gay Pride Parade. Our church does participate in the Gay Pride Parade. And all of those of you who are committee members, would you just kind of raise your hand? We've got several in this group. And I'm proud to see all of you here tonight. So we have a meeting this Tuesday. It's 5:30 to 6:30. And we are inclusive of everyone. And I know the church likes to know who's on what committees, but we just invite everybody. So we're meeting in the Oxford Room, and you're welcome to come.
Thank you, Becky. All right, so you've got an evaluation form or a feedback form there. If you want to share anything with us, you're not required to fill that out, not required to put your name on it. But if there's something you'd like to share, certainly you're welcome to do that. I do encourage you to not leave the discussion here, but to continue to think and pray about this. Explore your own feelings and thoughts about it. Learn more about it. Think about it in terms of how it relates to your faith and your own spiritual practices, and try to remain open to see if God is leading you to take any action on this. All right, let's have if you want to stand, I'll send us forth. Well, Holy God, we give you thanks for creating the church, for the privilege that we all have of coming to this great church whom others have established and sustained over all these years. We pray, just as in the days of Jesus and Paul and Peter, that we can remain relevant to the needs of people and respond in love. We go forth to do so in the name of Christ. Let all the people say, Amen. Bless you. Have a great night.